If you've ever read sex ed advice for tweens and thought, okay, but this doesn't quite fit my autistic child, you're probably right. And if that tween is autistic, there's usually a very good reason for that. A lot of the usual advice assumes a way of learning and processing that simply doesn't fit many autistic kids. And over the last 30 plus years of working in sex ed and as an autistic ADHD parent of neurodivergent kids myself, this is something I see over and over again. Parents often think they need a completely different set of sex ed topics for their autistic child, but that's usually not the problem. What usually needs to change is the way the teaching happens. It's not the content, it's the delivery. And it's how clear the teaching is and how much pressure is around it and whether the timing actually works for that child. And once you understand that, the whole thing starts to feel a lot more doable. So let's look at why sex ed can feel so different when your tween is autistic. One of the first things parents notice is that the usual sex ed advice feels a bit clunky in real life. It sounds fine when you read it, but when you imagine actually saying it to your child, you can already tell it probably won't land very well. Might feel too vague, too rushed, or like it expects your child to fill in a lot of blanks, which they usually can't do, especially neurodivergent kids. And honestly, this is something I've seen for years. A lot of mainstream advice assumes social intuition, easy back and forth conversation, and a child being able to work out what the adult really means without much being explained. And look, that's a big ask for a lot of autistic tweens, and it's one reason parents so often feel like they're missing something. So if you've been feeling like the usual advice doesn't quite work in your house, that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. And it doesn't mean your child can't learn this. Often, it just means that the teaching methods are poor match. And that matters because the next shift is that bit that helps parents finally stop second guessing themselves. Autistic tweens don't usually need a completely different sex ed curriculum. They still need the core topics: bodies, puberty, privacy, consent, boundaries, relationships, online safety. All of that still matters. The difference is that the teaching often needs to be clearer, it needs to be more explicit, more paced and less pressure filled. And that distinction really matters because a lot of parents worry that if their child's autistic, they now need some highly specialized, complicated version of sex ed. You don't. Usually, it's the same important information that your kid needs. It's just taught in a way that your child actually learns. And that is a very different thing. This is one of the clearest patterns I've seen across years of sex ed work. Neurodivergent kids, they don't need less information and they don't need watered down information. They actually need teaching that's actually easier to process and easier to come back to. And one of the biggest pieces in that is clarity, because vague teaching creates problems very quickly. If the language is vague, your child is usually left to guess. And guessing is a terrible safety strategy. Words like be careful, be appropriate, or you'll know if something feels wrong can sound fine to adults, but they're often too fuzzy to be genuinely useful, especially for a child who processes language literally or needs things explained more concretely. This is something I've seen over and over again in sex ed. Adults often think they're being gentle when they're actually being unclear. They soften the message, they hint, they leave parts out, and then expect the kid to somehow join the dots and make sense of it. But a lot of autistic tweens, they're not working from those same hidden assumptions. What helps more is literal, direct, concrete teaching. So saying what you mean, explaining the why, giving enough detail to make the rule usable, not just sounding polite. And once parents start doing that, things often get easier. But clarity on its own is not enough because timing is another place where this often falls apart. This is where a lot of parents get tripped up. A child being available is not the same as a child being ready. And age is not the full answer either. You could have the right topic explain it really well, but if the timing is off, the information might not land in a useful way at all. And as both a sex educator and a parent, this is something I've had to keep reminding myself of too. Just because now feels like a good time to me doesn't mean it's a good time for my child. And in that moment with the nervous system as well, if they're overloaded, deeply focused on something else, stressed, or already shutting down, it's probably going in what you're saying. And that doesn't mean avoiding the topic. It just means pacing it better, shorter conversations, more layering in the information bit by bit, and coming back later and letting sex ed be something you build over time instead of trying to get it all done in one go. And that matters more than people realize, because even really good information won't help much if the nervous system can't actually access it. No child learns well when they're overloaded, dysregulated, or feeling pressured. And honestly, parents don't teach well in that state either. If you're anxious, rushing, or trying to force conversation because you're scared of getting it wrong, your child will usually feel that long before they take in the actual information. One thing I've learned over decades in this work is that information alone does not make sex ed effective. The relationship matters. The tone matters. Whether the child feels safe enough to stay with the conversation matters. And that's why connection is not just some soft extra bit here. It's a part of the teaching. And this is also why I talk so much about being an askable parent. Because when sex ed feels calm, clear, and manageable, kids are much more likely to come back later with a question or worry or something they just need help with. And that is a huge part of what we're aiming for here. But there's one more piece that really helps parents with this. This is not about turning sex ed into some huge specialist project. It's not about making it more complicated, and it's not about saying autistic kids need completely different topics from everybody else. It's about recognizing that they often need the teaching delivered in a way that's easier to process, easier to come back to, and easier to use. And that means more clarity, pacing the conversations, more repetition, and a lot less pressure. It means not relying on intuition, hidden meanings, or rushed conversations. And honestly, that often helps a lot of kids, not just autistic kids. But for autistic tweens, it can be the difference between information that stays abstract and then information that actually makes sense and becomes protective. So when the usual sex ed advice feels wrong, the answer is not to panic and think your child is too different for this. The answer is usually to look at the teaching method first, because when the method changes, the whole thing often becomes much more workable. And that's the part I really want parents to take with them. If sex ed feels harder with your autistic tween, it does not automatically mean you need a completely different roadmap for sex ed. Very often, it actually means you just need clearer teaching, better timing, more regulation, and less pressure. Some core topics, better delivery, and really, that's also how you become a more askable parent. Not by having the perfect script and not by doing one giant talk really well, but by being the parent who feels calmer, clearer, and easy to come back to. And that is what helps conversations stay open over time, which is what we actually want. If this helped, the next step is learning how to teach sex ed in the way your child's brain actually learns best, because that's where this starts to get even more practical. And you'll find lots of information to help you with all of that at the Sex Ed Rescue website.